Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 6408 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to terminate the tax-exempt status of terrorist-supporting organizations as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 270, H.R. 6408. A bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to terminate the tax-exempt status of terrorist-supporting organizations.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 6408, bipartisan legislation introduced by Ways and Means members David Kustoff and Brad Schneider. This common-sense bill revokes the tax-exempt status of entities that have been found to be providing material support to terrorist organizations within the past 3 years. This legislation is more important than ever, given Iran's attacks on Israel this weekend. It is thanks to the strong alliance that exists between the U.S. and Israel that our ally was able to defend itself. However, this legislation speaks to the broader efforts America must undertake to ensure our support for Israel and to counteract the forces of violence and terrorism that threaten our ally and our own homeland. There are multiple fronts in this battle against terrorism, and this bill addresses one that perhaps does not get as much attention as it should. As part of our aggressive oversight efforts, the Ways and Means Committee has been examining the behavior of U.S.-based organizations that enjoy generous tax exemptions and other benefits under our tax code. That investigation included a hearing in November of last year following the horrific attacks on Israel by Hamas terrorists. During that hearing, one witness, a terrorism financing expert, remarked on how this legislation would serve as a valuable tool to not just the Treasury Department, but the Department of Justice and the FBI to identify and disrupt terrorism-related activities on U.S. soil. We must continue to look into the actions of certain tax-exempt groups that are suspected of financing the activities of known terrorist organizations like Hamas. One example is the Holy Land Foundation. This tax-exempt organization funneled over $12 million in donations from Americans to fund Hamas before it was shut down by the U.S. government in the early 2000s. We also suspect that there are other groups that are operating in the United States that are providing material support to known terrorist organizations, including Hamas. It should go without saying that America's tax code should not be used to support or finance violent terrorism around the world. However, we have to be vigilant in the face of groups that seek to exploit the generosity of the American people and American taxpayers. We should ensure they cannot funnel resources to those that target civilians and harm our citizens and our allies. I call on all my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 6408, and I am proud to support this important legislation today and proud that it is being brought to the floor in a bipartisan way. I'm proud to have worked to bring this to the floor with my fellow Ways and Means colleague, Representative David Kustoff from Tennessee. As was mentioned, this past weekend, Iran launched an unprecedented attack on Israel for the very first time from Iranian territory, firing cruise and ballistic missiles as well as suicide attack drones. Thankfully, Again, as was noted, a coalition of Israeli, U.S., UK, Jordanian, French, and other allies coordinated a remarkable defense, defeating 99% of the missiles and drones before they were able to reach their intended targets. This achievement reflects the power of alliances. Alliances we have worked incredibly hard to build and need to work to always maintain. Iran, on the other hand, is aligned with groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and militias in Iraq and Syria. Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, backing a broad group of terrorist organizations in the region and across the world. In fact, just last week, a court in Argentina concluded that it was Iran that planned the fatal attack against the Jewish Community Center in 1994, 30 years ago, and the court declared it a crime against humanity. The alliances we create must be able to stand up to the horrific alliances that Iran is trying to build. And that's why this legislation is so important. As the attacks of October 7th highlighted, we must be doing everything we can to assist allies like Israel, to disempower the enemies who seek to do not just our allies harm, in the case of Hamas, to destroy the Jewish state and kill the Jewish people, but to also attack the United States. And this was made even clearer this weekend when Iran launched its multifaceted assault on Israel. That's why Speaker Johnson must bring the Senate-passed legislation providing for Israeli security assistance, as well as funding to help our allies in Ukraine and Taiwan. We have to have the Senate bill come to the floor for a House so it can immediately go to the President's desk for signature to assist these allies who are facing these threats. The Senate passed it in a deeply bipartisan vote, and I have no doubt it would have the votes to pass in the House if the Speaker would just bring it to the floor. We cannot dither or wait. The Iranian attacks over the weekend demonstrate the serious urgency with which we must act, and anything less than the passage of the Senate-passed aid bill will be grossly insufficient. As members of the House Ways and Means Committee, it is our job to be good stewards of the tax code, to ensure its faithful enforcement, and to empower the Treasury Department to go after tax cheats. As my colleague mentioned, we must look into the acts of groups like the Holy Land Foundation and others who are potentially providing material support for terrorist groups. We must do everything we can to cut off from financing groups like Hamas and other terrorist organizations, and errant nonprofit organizations that have been prosecuted for funneling money to Hamas and others. These organizations must be held accountable for providing material support to terrorist organizations. And as this legislation makes clear, these organizations must never be allowed to enjoy the privilege of tax-exempt status. Financiers who exploit tax-exempt status to hide their nefarious work behind nonprofit organizations must be held accountable. And doing so plays an important role in our work to combat the financing of terrorist organizations like Hamas. This bill ensures Treasury has the tools necessary to do exactly that, while also providing thoughtful safeguards that protect due process. That's why I'm proud to be able to bring this bill to the floor today. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as he may consume to the sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to thank Chairman Jason Smith, not only for his leadership in this legislation and this bill, but also for his support. H.R. 6408, it's an important bipartisan piece of legislation that will revoke the tax-exempt status for any organization that provides financial support or resources to designated terrorist groups, such as Hamas or Hezbollah. And I do want to thank my colleague, Representative Brad Snyder, for joining me in introducing what I think is a very important bill. There's no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that since Hamas's barbaric attack on Israel, we've seen a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism and, frankly, anti-Israel motivated attacks here at home and around the world. In fact, we saw it here in the United States today. Israel's recent attack on our ally Israel was a stark reminder of why we must confront Iran and its terrorist proxy groups. These same groups have also increased attacks on American troops in the region. Acts of terror anywhere in the world, they will not be tolerated. Now, a crucial pillar in the global fight against terrorism is dismantling the financial networks of terrorist organizations. Without access to resources and funding, terrorist organizations are seriously restricted in their ability to carry out attacks in the very first place. Recent reports indicate that there are U.S.-based nonprofits that are suspected of providing support and funding to terrorist groups. That's an amazing statement to make. But many of these organizations, they have special 501c tax-exempt status, which allows their donors to claim a tax deduction. To put it plainly, domestic financiers of terrorism are currently being subsidized by U.S. taxpayer dollars. And let me be very clear, Mr. Speaker, no American should receive a tax benefit for funding terrorism. Right now, our ability to crack down on tax-exempt organizations that support terrorism is frankly inadequate. Doing so under current law requires a time-consuming bureaucratic process that has sometimes prevented federal authorities from acting. And that's why we introduced this crucial legislation that we'll be voting on hopefully later today. This legislation will authorize the United States Treasury to revoke the tax-exempt status of any organization deemed to have provided material support or resources to a designated terrorist group within the past 3 years. Material support, it includes financing, services, training, any tangible or intangible aid that helps terrorist groups advance their objectives. Under no circumstances should organizations that support terrorism be allowed to receive preferential treatment under the United States tax code. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is a crucial step towards dismantling the financial networks of terrorist organizations across the globe, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I urge all my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, to support this important bipartisan piece of legislation that will bring us one step closer to eradicating terrorism around the world. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you, and I yield back.
The yields. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Connecticut, Congressman Larson.
And from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to first and foremost commend Brad and David for their incredible work, and also point out that it's not often when you bring out a piece of legislation that you author that you get an opportunity to have your mother in the audience and observe, well, that that legislation is about to be voted on, as it was in the committee, and I commend Chairman Smith. This is an important piece of legislation, and as David was just saying, no one should ever receive a tax benefit for aiding and abetting terrorists. It's just absurd, but sometimes it takes common sense, practical individuals to stand up and make sure that we get this right, and I commend both of these gentlemen for their outstanding work. I also thank and want to thank Mr. Schneider for bringing this up. What we experienced on Saturday was incredible, but demonstrates when nations stick together in common bond as allies against terrorism and terrorist attack, good things can transpire and happen. The attack on Israel on Saturday, to have been thwarted in the way that it was by both Israel, the United States and our allies, the world was taking notice. But as Mr. Schneider pointed out, the world is also taking notice this weekend on what's transpiring in the Ukraine. Imagine, during this same time, 130 drones, 80 missiles, 700 bombs, just in last week alone, were directed at the people of Ukraine. The supplemental the president asked for back in October, the Senate passed a supplemental bill more than 2 months ago. That bill is sitting in this chamber, waiting for Congress, the House of Representatives, to stand up on behalf of the Ukrainian people, on behalf of our allies. The world is watching while the House of Representatives dithers. People's lives are at stake. This is nothing short of a catastrophic tragedy for the people of Ukraine, as they must watch aghast as the House of Representatives sits and does not take action to come to their aid and relief. It's long overdue, as this legislation does, for us to act in a bipartisan basis. There is no question, America, that if this bill, the supplemental bill, is brought to the floor, that's been passed by the Senate, that sits here waiting for our approval, will pass overwhelmingly and bipartisanly. Stop holding the supplemental back. Bring it forward. Provide the people of the Ukraine the relief they need. Provide the humanitarian relief for the Palestinians. Make sure that Israel and Taiwan get the fortification and support that they need from the American government. That is our responsibility. I don't know how people can go home and look in the mirror knowing that a valued ally of ours has put so much on the line and is standing up to Putin, standing up to a dictator, standing up to a tyrant who's using the same formula as Adolf Hitler. Rise up, Congress. Do your job. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, David, for your bill.
I reserve. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
We're prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers at this time. I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my friend, John Larson, for his passionate words, his urgent plea to pass the essential national security legislation that will bring aid to our allies in Ukraine, in Israel, and in Taiwan. Enjoying tax-exempt status under Section 501 of the tax code is indeed a privilege. As good stewards of the U.S. tax code, it is our duty to ensure the Treasury Department has the tools it needs to enforce this section. At a time of great threat to our allies, and in particular to Israel, from Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, we must exercise all powers at our disposal to constrain funding for these terrorist organizations, including combating errant nonprofit organizations based here in the United States who are providing material support for these groups overseas. I again want to thank my colleague, Representative Kustoff, for his partnership and work on this legislation. I want to thank Ranking Member Neal and Chairman Smith for your leadership. And I urge all of my colleagues to not only support this legislation, but also, as we have said, to support the essential security funding that came from the Senate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Yields. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remainder of my time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United States must use every tool in our toolbox to combat organizations that threaten America and our allies like Israel. That includes going after the flow of money and resources from U.S.-based so-called charitable organizations to the terrorist groups that murder civilians around the world. We cannot turn a blind eye to entities that support terrorism and known terrorist groups while exploiting our tax code to cover their tracks and pursue their malicious goals. It is unacceptable for any organization to receive taxpayer support while they are funneling millions of dollars to Hamas, an organization responsible for the horrific attacks against the people of Israel on October 7th. We must do more to ensure such groups are not able to operate under the cover of our tax code. I urge all my colleagues to vote yes on this measure, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields.